So this section is going to be about the stages of cell respiration. So before we get into the stages, let's review that cell respiration is going to be how we get energy from those glucose molecules that we ingest. So how are we going to make ATP from the energy stored in those glucose molecule bonds? So there are going to be 4 stages we're going to talk about, and for each stage we're going to talk about what molecules are going into it, what molecules are coming out of it, so the beginning and end products. Then we're going to talk about whether any ATP is made and how many ATPs are made at each stage. Because remember, that's the whole point, is to make ATP so we have energy. And then the last part is talking about how many electrons are going to be harvested. Now, when we talk about electrons being harvested, we're talking about NAD plus getting reduced to NADH. So we're going to talk about how many of those electrons actually do that, and that's going to all end up at the last stage called the electron transport chain. So if we look at this picture here, this is showing us all of the stages of cell respiration. And most of them are going to happen inside here, which is the mitochondrion. So that's going to be the organelle where cell respiration is going to happen. Now, the only stage that's going to happen entirely outside of the mitochondrion is going to be glycolysis. So we have glycolysis, then we're going to have a little middle stage here called pyruvate oxidation that this isn't showing. Then we're going to have the citric acid cycle, and at the end we're going to have electron transport. So those are going to be the 4 stages that we're going to talk about. There's also a video that accompanies this that's really, really good that kind of shows you all these different stages happening. Okay, so the first stage we're going to talk about is called glycolysis. Now, if we look at this word, glyco means glucose, and lysis means breaking apart. So what this is going to be is actually breaking apart a glucose molecule. So here, actually, let's go here. I'm going to show you this slide, and what this is showing you is our glucose molecule right here. Now, if you remember, glucose is C6H12O6. The only part we're going to be worried about are the carbons right here. So here you can see that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. So what we're going to do is actually split it right down the middle. So we have 3 carbons here and 3 carbons here. So 2 separate 3-carbon molecules. Now, in order for that to happen, we have to invest some energy. So here you can see we're taking 2 ATPs and using those. And when we use ATP, remember, we're taking that 3rd phosphate off of each of those, and we're making it into ADP. So anytime you see ATP being converted into ADP, that's going to be using energy. So right here we have used 2 ATPs. If we go a little bit further in this reaction, the next thing that's going to happen is NAD plus is going to get reduced to NADH. So what that means is, if you remember, hydrogen can carry 2 electrons. So when we say NAD plus is getting reduced to NADH, that means that it is taking 2 electrons. So this is that cofactor, coenzyme, and that is going to take those electrons all the way to the electron transport chain, which is further down this whole process. Okay, now the next stage, we're going to create 4 ATPs. So here you can see we're creating 2 ATPs up here, and down here you can see we're creating 2 ATPs here. So we've made 4 ATPs, and we've used 2 ATPs over here. So the overall amount of ATPs, or the net ATPs that we create, is 2 total. Okay, now let's look at this video to show you how this all works. So glycolysis, like I was saying, is going to be something that happens outside of the mitochondria. And this video is really good. I'm going to post it for you, and you should definitely watch it. So this is showing glucose more in its normal form. And you'll notice that 2 ATPs are coming in, and eventually what's going to happen is that's going to split into those 2 separate molecules. And eventually, there's our NAD plus that's picking up the 2 electrons and becoming NADH, and it's going to carry those electrons over to another part. And eventually, we're going to make 2 ATPs in this process. So let's go back to your notes and kind of talk about what we just saw. So glycolysis is actually a 10 reaction pathway. If you're dying to see what that reaction pathway looks like, you can see this lovely picture here. Don't worry about this. This is frightening. But this is how I actually had to learn it, and I had to actually regurgitate this on my exams in my undergraduate. I'm not bitter or anything. Don't worry. You don't have to know that. So anyway, um, going back to our notes, it's a 10 reaction pathway. And this is making ATP using substrate level phosphorylation. So if you remember, that's using an enzyme to just snap that phosphate off of something else and put it onto ATP. So this is that first stage in the 4 stages. It's converting glucose into those 2 3-carbon molecules of pyruvate. So glucose is turning into pyruvate. Now, glycolysis is going to be something that can happen if oxygen is around or even if oxygen is not, and we'll talk about that a little later. So we're going to get a net of 2 ATP molecules. So remember, we used 2, we made 4, so 4 minus 2 gives us 2, okay? That is not a lot of ATP, but we'll talk about other areas where we're going to make more ATP. The last thing that's important is those electrons are getting harvested and carried out by NADH. So NADH is carrying 4 electrons out into to another part of the stages. Okay, now when we go on to these next stages, what we're going to do is we're going to pretend that oxygen is around because that's the most common way that these phases are going to happen. So in the next video, we'll get into the other stages which go a little bit more quickly.